I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and channel it for good.
Deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. Free and uncorrupted communication.
Dr. Kikasola earned his PhD from Brandeis in Coptic and ancient languages and Egyptian hieroglyphics. He's the professor of international policy at the School of Government, Regent University, with a joint appointment in the School of Law and the School of Divinity. Professor Kikasola has teaching competencies in linguistics, biblical law, political philosophy, Middle East politics, and Islam. He's published about a dozen articles and tape series, and 2 books are in progress. He reads Hebrew and Arabic on a regular basis, and he speaks frequently on the radio, television, and at conferences on foreign policy, the Middle East, and global Islamic politics. In fact, if some of you have seen the flyers for Dr. Kikasola, he recently delivered the message that he's going to give you tonight to the World Affairs Council in Virginia, where Douglas Walker, the senior economist to the United Nations for the past 30 years, gave this message, this presentation, just effusive praise. And so tonight we're going to host that same message for you tonight to listen to and to also host your questions afterward. And so with a warm round of applause, if you please, welcome Dr. Kikasola. Yes.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be at the Veritas Forum, the forum that talks about truth, Veritas, here at UCLA in California. Thank you, Tim Schultz, for that introduction and for all the work you have done in organizing this Veritas Forum, and for all the workers that I have met this week so far. I'd like to give my thanks also to Regent University, my employer, for allowing me to teach all these years in the School of Government and of Law, and to some degree in the School of Divinity. And finally, to all those students who've done their thesis with me, or their Plato, a publishable law article thesis option. Regent University is a Christian graduate school in Virginia Beach, Virginia. We don't have any undergraduate programs, but we have master's and doctoral programs, and I'm glad to represent them here tonight. Here we're gathered on Tuesday evening on the 20th of April at the Ackerman Grand Ballroom of UCLA. The fun time is going to come from approximately 8 until 10 on the Q&A. I'm dealing with a huge subject tonight, and so I instructed Veritas, this is a condition on my coming, that we have at least 2 hours of Q&A. And it's not going to be with question cards, it's going to be floor microphones, so you can come with any question whatsoever, either whether I've treated it or not, whether it's related to this subject or not. And I look forward to that time with you. My topic is, what political reforms are possible in the Islamic Middle East? So you see, it's dealing with politics, reform, and Islam in the Middle East, with some global implications. And the subtitle is The Bush Foreign Policy and Islamic Constitutionalism. So there's going to be a lot of politics and law intermingled. And I'm going to be telling you what Muslims say. This is my specialty currently, especially since September 11, is Islamic politics. But I need to start off with a number of rejoinders and surrejoinders. And even before that, I have to give you some disclaimers. I'm obviously speaking as a Christian, but this is not going to be about Christianity. And it's certainly not going to be about evangelism, on how Christians evangelize Muslims, which we do all the time, and Muslims, how they evangelize Christians, which they do all the time. We share the Bible with Muslims, and Muslims invite us to their da'wah, to the call of Islam to non-Muslims. I'll be happy to take Q&A on that, and how we Christians evangelize Muslims and how Muslims evangelize us Christians. So it's not going to be a specifically religious address. It's political and legal. But my waking thought this morning when I woke up, my very first thought, if you will permit me to quote the Hebrew Bible, Darashti et Adonai ve'anani u'mekol megudotai hitzilani. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and he delivered me from all my fears. My fears that no matter which position I take on the Middle East, it's going to be controversial. And I ask for the Lord's protection, the inventor of the Middle East, the one who created us all. That is from Psalm 34 and verse 4. And then my next thought was in Greek of the New Testament, from the book of Philippians, chapter 4 and verse 13. Panta iskuo in to endunama untime. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That was the next religion down the line. Judaism first, and then Christianity. And my third thought was from the Quran, the next monotheistic religion, the language and the Arabic of Islam. Surah 2, 256, in Arabic, La ikraha fidin. There is no coercion in religion. And that was my prayer for those of you who are Muslims, that you would take that word from the Lord, from Allah, seriously, that the nature of religion itself is self-evident, that it cannot be coercive. It is voluntaristic as a policy, and it's voluntary as a human decision. So, having dealt with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam and their very serious prayers, I'd like to say that my second disclaimer is that this address is not about Islam per se. In fact, just to shorten that for you, if you would like to read just one book on Islam, I'd like to make a suggestion. Oxford Press in 2002 published a wonderful book by Melise Ruthven, a Scottish scholar, Ruthven. It's called Islam in the World, the second edition in 2000. I advocate that to you as to what I think is a scholarly exposition by Oxford Press on what Islam is. My third disclaimer, I hope you will not be too disappointed, but there's nothing in my title about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I don't intend to treat it. But I promise you, in the Q&A, if I get a question on the Arab-Israeli conflict, I will deal with it. I look forward to that. I teach courses in Middle East politics, the Arab-Israeli conflict, as well as, of course, Islamic politics. But if you would like to read what I think is a well-balanced book on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I would like to suggest to you Shibli Telhami, and he calls it The Stakes. Mr. Telhami, Telhami, has written a book, The Stakes, America in the Middle East. It's Westward Publishers of this year, 2004. And my last disclaimer, is that this lecture is not even about Iraq directly. As fascinating as that would be, I'm not going to be dealing directly with just war, the doctrine of just war, or even with preemption, which was the basis of the current invasion of Iraq. But I'm quite a student of just war, and I'll be happy to take a question on that. So I've used up half my time, so you want to know what I'm going to talk about, right? Well, let me just say that there are several benefits already from the United States and Britain and the coalition being in Iraq. I'll say this much. We don't have Saddam to deal with anymore. And the one thing that sticks out in my mind about this is after Saddam Hussein was arrested in Iraq, I remember one website of an Arab citizen of the world, of some nation, I forget which, was very insulted that on television we were examining Saddam's teeth to see if he needed dental care. And he thought that was an offense to Uruba, to Arabness, to show Saddam's teeth. And I'm not a student enough of Arab culture to know if that was an insult, but I thought about it. And it's interesting, the next letter that came over the email, the next email that came onto the website was from an Iraqi citizen who had lost his parents through the murderous acts of Saddam. And he said, you know, it's funny, you take offense at seeing Saddam's teeth in public. I saw my parents' teeth in their skeleton. I saw thousands of skeletons, no flesh, gaping, open mouths, teeth and all. What about that exposure, Mr. Saddam? Interesting thought. The other observation that I see is a benefit of the Iraq war that's going on right now with the coalition is Iran. Iran has already agreed that we should allow these Russian-built nuclear plants to be examined, to be inspected by the international community. Yet at the same time, they see so much democracy in the air that they have disallowed the reformists in Iran to run for re-election. So you have this inner control and this outer conformity. There's another benefit in Syria. Syria has already agreed, working through Turkey, to work with Israel, not Israel directly, but Syria through Turkey, has already agreed to reopen negotiations on the Golan Heights, which Syria lost to Israel in the war of 1967. And they don't have to worry about Saddam cutting off their oil because they're talking to the Israelis, even indirectly. Saddam cannot cut off the oil anymore. Syria is now a little more safe in negotiating with the West. And then there's been an enormous benefit in Afghanistan as a result of the Iraq war. We now have a constitution, which I will discuss later, in Afghanistan. We have a NATO security protecting that nation with UN guidance. Another benefit is Libya. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, has decided to get out of the mass destruction business and has already opened his inspections to the UN. And believe it or not, even in North Korea, yes, communist North Korea, is now agreed to show their nuclear facilities, these nuclear facilities that they've done in spite of their treaties that they have had, due to the new credibility of the United States and its new firmness. And we know how it happened. We told the Chinese that if you do not talk the North Koreans into opening their nuclear facilities, that we are going to put missiles, defensive missiles, in Japan and in Taiwan. And China doesn't want to lose its hegemony in the Pacific, so in the east there. So China has spoken to Pyongyang, you will show your nuclear facilities to the West. And then lastly, even the Israelis and the Palestinians have enjoyed some benefit of the United States and Britain and others in Iraq. Remember, Arafat considered Saddam his ally. And you remember during the Gulf War I, 1990-1991, it was Yasser Arafat of the Palestinian Authority who went to Iraq and congratulated Saddam and supported him in his invasion of Kuwait. And remember this, Saddam is the only one in the history of the world that ever dropped missiles on Tel Aviv. Well, Saddam is not there anymore to be a protector of Yasser Arafat. He will now have to deal with the West without Saddam. There are other benefits, but that's all I have time for to speak of tonight about Iraq. What I want to deal with is about reform in Islam. And my thesis is, if I may use the word of Samuel Huntington, while there is a civilizational clash between the West and the rest, between the West, which celebrates liberty as its highest value, and the rest, which celebrates conformity as its highest value, something far more profound that I'm going to say over and over again tonight, and that is, more true than that, more profound, is the civilizational clash within Islam. There is a freedom versus conformity conflict going on within Islam today. Many, many witnesses of this in English and in Arabic and in other languages that I will share with you. So, we want to deal, first of all, in my talk tonight with four things. Let me put it to you briefly. I'd like to speak to you about containment, about engagement, about the Islamic remedies for this engagement, and then lastly, with constitutionalism in Muslim states. And everything beyond that I'll be happy to entertain in the Q&A. I hope you're in this audience old enough to remember this phrase: NATO worked. Perhaps you were watching television that evening as I was. John Chancellor of NBC News, on the night that the Berlin Wall fell on November the 9th, 1989, the opening line of his broadcast was "NATO worked." And he explained how the Western doctrine of nuclear deterrence brought down the Berlin Wall. Reagan had said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And eventually it came down because the Russians understood MAD. They understood mutually assured destruction, massive destruction from nuclear weapons. And suddenly the world changed. We went, and shortly after that, after '89, in 1991, the former Soviet Union became CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States. And we moved from the bipolar world in which we had all of our emphasis on stability, and then maybe we can afford the luxury of reform. And we were not willing to take the risk of liberty and the risk of reform, because stability before communist Russia meant everything. Everything got subordinated to stability, even to the point of us supporting repressive governments in the Middle East, because we could not trust an Islamic democracy at that time. We're only willing to work with Arabic governments that agree to be anti-communist, to be anti-Soviet. So at this time in the bipolar world, the Soviets versus the United States, the whole West, we certainly put security above reform. And even in 1992 in Algeria, when there was an Islamic party that had what was about to win the election in Algeria, in North Africa, the Islamic Party was about to win, and it was the Algerian government that disallowed the election because they were not afraid of one man, one vote, but they were afraid of the Islamic precedent of one man, one vote, one time. That if the Islamic Party got in, there would be one election and no more elections. So the Algerians themselves, the pro-democratic Algerians, sided against the anti-democratic Islamists in Algeria who were using the election to end all elections in Algeria. And when they shut down the election, you remember the death that preceded that and followed that at that very sad time. And then there was a hiatus of where we were in between the two worlds, and now the one world that we have today, of one great power, which is the United States. And then we went to engagement, my second point. Then came, you see, 9/11, September the 11th, 2001. We had there the terrible Islamist radicals' invasion of New York City and D.C. And in grammar school, you learned your alphabet, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U. R comes before S. We had had S before R all those years with the Soviet Union. Stability ahead of reform. But since September 11, we have a new doctrine in the West. We often call it the Bush Doctrine, which was initiated by his administration, which clearly, pronouncedly, declares it as R before S, reform before stability. And this powerful address is spoken of by Farhad Kazemi as a sea change in U.S. policy. I don't know if you're familiar with this publication, The Great Decisions. This is put out by the World Affairs Council, in which I am active. Great Decisions, Foreign Policy Association, the anniversary edition, 2004. And Kazemi has an article in here in which he shows that he and most of the Islamic world is aware that this is a sea change in foreign policy, to go from stability at any price, then maybe reform, to reform and then stability. We had now the luxury, with the Soviet Union behind us, to do it right this time, and not to be supporting all these tin-horn dictators in the Middle East who are repressing the democratic Muslims because it is a threat to their rule in the Middle East. At the same time, repressing the Islamists because they do not want a theocratic takeover. And in November 2003, our President, George W. Bush, made a trip to London, and he gave his stirring address there at that time that we can no longer be accommodating the lack of freedom in the Middle East because it did nothing to make us safe. Because in the long run, stability cannot be purchased at the expense of liberty. As long as the Middle East remains a place where freedom does not flourish, it shall remain a place of stagnation, resentment, and violence ready for export. What this is saying is, politically, only Muslims can change Muslims. And even then, Muslims can't change Muslims. But there's one thing for sure. If there is going to be a chance for change, it's going to be reformist Muslims making those changes that are necessary for the autocracies or the theocracies, the dictatorships or the clericalisms that exist in the Middle East. Only they can change it. And we are now going to support the reformist. And we're going to work with governments and with peoples that are determined to work in the direction of reform. So we move to engagement. That is a sea change. S to R now becomes R to S, as it is in alphabetical order. Now I'd like to speak to you thirdly about Islamic remedies. Islam has responded in a very wide variety of ways to this engagement doctrine of the West, especially of the United States. This class of civilizations that I spoke about between the West and the rest is really this liberty versus conformity as the chief value is now a civilizational conflict within Islam itself, and there most profoundly is its meaning. There are many Muslims who share the value of the West, that the highest of all human values is liberty before God, whereas many of the traditionalists in the Islamic world seek conformity before God as the chief value. In fact, if I could trace the spectrum of Islam going from the political right to the political left, I would use these terms. On the far right, I see the Islamists, the theocrats, who are avidly convinced that democracy is inconsistent with the Quran and with the Sharia law. That is a small group of people, but in addition to them, moving a little to the left, are the traditional Muslims, where the mass of Islam is, and I call them traditional Muslims or accommodationists. That is, they are convinced too that democracy is inconsistent with the teaching of Islam, but they're willing to accommodate themselves to the West until they gain the upper hand, either by birth rates or by evangelism or by petrodollars or by political reforms in the direction of Islamization of the West. So you got the Islamists and the traditional Muslims, or the accommodationists, who are not willing to work with the West, or who are, but both of whom are convinced that democracy is not possible, not correct for Muslims. Now, moving to the left, you have reformist Muslims who believe that democracy is consistent with Islam. And to the left of them, you have the secular Muslims. Secular Muslims don't need religious reasons for believing in democracy. They get there by common sense, by philosophy, by history, by experience. Reformist Muslims are democratic too, but they have to have Quranic reasons. They have to have religious and Islamic reasons for believing in democracy. So if I can state what I just stated going from left to right, you've got secularists and reformists among Muslims, Democrats all. Some need religious reasons, some don't, for defending the prosperity that has existed in the West and it can exist in the Middle East. As opposed to those on the right, the traditional Muslims, mostly accommodationists, they work with us as long as it's to their advantage, and the Islamists who see no advantage in that, nothing but conflict with the West. So you got these secularists and reformists on the left, and the traditionalists and the Muslim Islamist on the right. The remedy, say the theocrats, is Islam, Islam. Islam huwa khal. Islam is the solution. And then among these Islamists, there are even smaller number of terrorists. And by terrorism in this talk tonight, I mean the killing of non-combatants for political advantage. And with all the differences we see in Israel, notice that distinction that I'm making. Terrorism, by definition, for my talk tonight, is the targeting, I said killing, but I mean specific targeting to kill non-combatants, that is civilians, to gain political advantage. There are a lot of killing of civilians by the Israelis, but they don't target them. It is contrary to Israeli policy to deliberately target civilians, non-combatants, to gain their political ends. But of course, lots of civilians die in their attempt to destroy those who have declared war against them by violent means. And yet, the most radical among the Palestinians, especially Hamas, openly targets non-combatants, targets them, discotheques, pizza joints, things of that nature, school buses filled with Israeli school children. Why? Is to achieve their political ends because of their desperation. Well, that makes a distinction between a terrorist and a nationalist. Freedom fighters. A terrorist, you see, is a criminal. He disobeys the laws of just war. People in uniform declaring war with one another and shooting it out, may the best man win, as opposed to deliberately targeting non-combatants, which by anyone's definition has to be an act of murder. So you've got these theocrats, some of whom are terrorists, and then you have these Democrats, some whom are secular, and others are reformist and very religious. And the reformists, which is a group I can work with the best, is because, like me, they're religious, and they have religious motivations for what they do. So as a Christian, can relate to them very well, because they're trying to produce a religious rationale for democracy and for friendship with the West. And so, let me just name a society with which I've had great relations. I go to their annual meetings every year in Washington, D.C. It's CSID, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. If you would like their website, I would urge you to look it up, www.islam-democracy. That's not underscore, that is hyphen. Islam, I-S-L-A-M, hyphen, democracy, D-E-M-O-C-R-A-C-Y, obviously, .org, O-R-G. You will be amazed at the spectrum of opinion, Democrats all, intellectuals all, who are trying to support Islam either religiously or historically by philosophy or by religious lore within Islam. It's a very, very encouraging phenomenon. Now, there are many of these religious reformers that I could mention, and in the shortness of time, allow me to just mention some of these. All of these have become personal friends of mine as I meet them in meetings. Let's take, for example, Abdulaziz Sachagina. Sachagina is a professor at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's University in Charlottesville, not too far from where I work in Virginia Beach. You have Radwan Masmoudi, who is the president of CSID. And then you have Luaid Safi, whom I debated once at a journalism conference, a Muslim from Syria, now in the United States, an American intellectual, who has his own website as well. S-A-F-I is how he spells that. And you have a young man, Muqtadar Khan, K-H-A-N, and he defends democracy with political philosophy and not with Sharia. In fact, he believes that Sharia law is the wrong way to approach the ultimate values of Islam, and he sees it rather in Islamic political philosophy, which in his case is very democratic in how he understands the Quran and the rest of religious literature in Islam. His website is well worth looking at. It's www.ijtihad, the Arabic word for interpretation or reinterpretation. That's I-J-T-I-H-A-D, ijtihad.org, O-R-G. Let's see, you have the Ahmadiyya movement in Pakistan, which is an older movement, which believes that the jihad, the holy war of the Quran, was never intended to be anything but defensive. Whether that is what Muhammad intended, I allow Muslims to decide that. I don't tell Muslims what I think the Quran means. I ask them. I don't expect them to tell me what the Old and the New Testament says. I expect them to ask me, since I know the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek, and I will tell them what the Old and the New Testament says. But they tell me that jihad was defensive, not offensive, and that one should never kill infidels simply because they're infidels, because they're non-Muslims. Now, whether that's the history of Islam or the teaching of the Quran is irrelevant to my purpose of promoting religious liberty in every nation on earth. That's my calling as a peacemaker, is to find people who have peaceful doctrines and to celebrate their capacity to get there and to act on that peaceful notion. And the opposite is terrorism. And remember, President Bush has carefully, repeatedly, almost to the point of monotony, constantly said, our war is not with Islam. As a matter of fact, it's not even with Islamic countries. Our war is against terrorism. And by the way, he means that those who target non-combatants for political ends, those who commit international murder, that is our enemy. We are going after international criminals, and not just them, but governments that will harbor them. We are reform-oriented. No longer are we going to put stability ahead of reform, but the reform is going to have to be, hopefully in our lifetime, in my lifetime, that we can destroy state-supported terrorism. Terrorism can never be destroyed. If you're bent on killing me, eventually you can do it very easily. But state-supported terrorism is something that the nations of the world can resist and can be victorious. That's a matter of public policy and a matter of diplomacy, and even ultimately of military policy. And so you have Muslims whose doctrine of war is very much akin to, in the West, the Judeo-Christian doctrine of just war, of defensive war, preemption being a type of defense. There are many others that I could mention here, and the rationales of how they get there. Let me just mention that briefly. You would say to me, if you've read the Quran, how on earth can a Muslim come up with what we call Western doctrines? Well, it is not difficult. Let me just list some of the hermeneutical ways that they can do it. I'm very fascinated by this. I'm interested in interpretation of documents. I'm a linguist by training. And here are some of the ways they can do it. Now, I'm going to use Christian terms for this. I know how to say it in Arabic, but I'll say it in Christian terms. Some of these Muslim Democrats are what I would call a dispensationalist. I use the word atzri for that in Arabic, meaning a modernist or a periodist. They don't like that term. So I use the word zamani, time after time, a periodist. They like that term. And they would say that, okay, all right, there was a jihad, there was not just spiritual warfare, not just social reform, but there was war against infidels because they were infidels. But that was limited to the first generation of Islam to protect the infant mosque against its enemies in Arabia and other places. And that dispensation is over. There are over 1 billion Muslims in the world today. We do not need jihad today in the sense of holy war, religious war. We don't need that today. So Allah protected the infant mosque, and that is not the way we should be responding to our religious or political opponents today. So they kind of say, in God's wisdom and Allah's wisdom, it was war then, holy war then, but not holy war now. That's one way of looking at that. Most Muslims that I've talked to, however, reformists, reject this approach. And some would say, well, no, really, it's a matter of abrogation. It's a matter of naskh. You have one verse that comes out is true in the Quran, and then in the later surahs, something different comes out. And the later surah, which is the greater truth, is a nasikh. It is an abrogator. And the earlier verse gets abrogated. It becomes mansukh. And so what happens is later verses abrogate earlier verses, and those of us who are Muslims are obligated to follow the later revelations of Muhammad. A process of abrogation. I can emphatically tell you that most reformist Muslims today reject that as unworthy of the Quran. They don't like the abrogationist motif that is used by some early hermeneuticists in trying to deal with this. Rather, they would say it's a matter of maqsid, or if you wish in the plural, maqatsid. It's a question of purposes, intent for each verse by each verse. Let me make the calculus real easy for you. Let me give you a real brief primer in Islamic hermeneutics. The Islamists, the jihadists, who are bent on killing us because we are not Muslims, interpret the peaceful verses in the Quran, and there are many, in the light of the warlike verses, and there are many of those. Whether they're offensive, defensive, I allow Muslims to tell us that. But there are many peaceful verses in the Quran, many warlike verses. And an Islamist inevitably interprets the peaceful verses in the light of the warlike verses, so that he can get on with his mission of settling scores with infidels to Allah's glory. The reformists are exactly the opposite. They interpret the warlike verses in the light of the peaceful verses. And they say, La ikraha fid-din. There is no coercion in religion. There cannot be, because it is a voluntary act which should be followed by a voluntaristic public policy. Reformists tend to emphasize shura, that is, consultation with the people. They tend to, the whole idea of consent, they tend to stress ijtihad, that is, interpretation and reinterpretation of the sources. And you remember what happened in the history of Islam, if you know a little bit about it. Islam had it, at the death of Muhammad in 632, had an enormous explosion all over the world through birth rates, through evangelism, and through holy war, and conquered all of the churches in North Africa, conquered Spain, and was in southern France by 732, the armies of Muhammad. 100 years after his death, from 632 to 732, all of North Africa had been conquered, all of the Middle East, all of Spain and southern France, and parts of the Middle East into northern India. Now that doesn't sound like defensive wars to me. It sounds like wars of conquest and empire to me. It's, shall we say, an Islamic crusade that preceded the Christian crusades. And as evil as the crusades are, and we Christians have repented of the crusades against the Middle East, the crusades were a counterpunch. It was a reaction to hundreds of years of Muslim conquest of Christian countries. But it doesn't make it right. And it's something that Christianity has rejected as a doctrine. It was inconsistent with the history of Christianity to have those religious wars against the Jews and the Muslims who lived in the Holy Land, and much slaughter that came from it. And so you've got Islam that became very successful, and by 1000 AD, they had become a large institutionalized religion. And they saw that the growth of Sharia law, of canonical law, was growing to the point and adjusting to all the various new cultures they had conquered, that if Islamic law kept changing, it would stop looking like Islam. So approximately 1000 AD, they closed the doors to ijtihad. They closed the doors to the reinterpretation and the growth of Islamic law. And there are special terms for that in Arabic, but essentially what they did is Islam, which was open to science and to modernity and protected by and large religious minorities, was now in revolt against modernity. And that's the backwardness that we see in Islamist societies. We see how dysfunctional a number of these theocratic regimes are. Because whenever you put church over state or religion over state, you end up sacralizing the world so that the slightest offense, like a traffic ticket, becomes a theological issue. Whereas in the West, we've made all kinds of other mistakes, especially in Europe. They put state over church, state over religion. That's a state church. And what you do there, whenever you put the state over the church, you secularize the church. Islam has church over state, if I can use a Christian term, religion over state, and you sacralize the world. Whereas if you have state over church, like in European West, you are secularizing the church. And thank the Lord, in our American experience, not due to any great wisdom of ours, but we learn from that experience. We build on European shoulders. And we left the Anglican Church, the Church of England, came to the United States, and we wanted the institutional separation of church and state. Not a horizontalization of state over church or church over state, but this institutional separation of church and state under God. That's not the separation of God and state. That's not the separation of morality and state. That's the separation of the institutional church from the institutional state. As Jesus said, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God what is God's. Make a distinction between your tithes and your taxes, both of which are a blessing to God and obligatory. Generosity before God and before men. So what Islam has had to do, and the secularists and the reformists are doing it, is they're opening the doors to ijtihad, to reinterpretation, and they're reinterpreting their experience in the light of modernity, in the light of history, and in the light of their own experience in many of their authoritarian governments which they seek to reform. Let me just come back to where we were on Islamic remedies. And let me briefly tell you something that's very disappointing that's happened in Europe. In France, for example, now remember France was a state church in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. That's Christians killing Christians, Catholic Christian countries killing Protestant Christian countries. And in 1648, in the Peace of Westphalia, they agreed to disagree, and religious wars ceased in Europe. They said, look, there's a simple solution. We're going to disestablish the Roman Empire, in which everybody has to be Roman Catholic in the Western Roman Empire, and we're going to have Protestant Christian countries, we're going to have Catholic Christian countries with a disestablished empire, but each of our states will be established. We'll have state churches. You have Protestant kings in a Protestant country, you'll have Catholic kings in a Catholic country. Well, the United States didn't go with that system. We had institutional separation of church and state. It's not a wall between church and state. It's an institutional separation of it. But in Europe and in France, they had a state church. And in time, they saw that was dysfunctional because the state tends to secularize the church. So they had a French Revolution, which was disastrous. It was a total secularization of democracy. Instead of a democracy that was built upon the religious affections of the people and their desire for liberty according to their understandings of God and His law, the law of nature and of nature's God, instead of that, they had an institutionalized secularization. And we saw that just these last few months in France, in which they passed these awful laws saying that in public places, the French government will not allow Muslim women to wear their hijab, or the males, wearing these kafia garments. You will dress like Frenchmen. Or you cannot, as a Jew in public places, wear your yarmulke, the kippah in Hebrew, the prayer skull cap. Or as Christians, the tzalib, the cross, these gaudy crosses that some of our gangster rappers love to wear. That's not going to be French anymore. And just 2 weeks ago, even the German government passed a same kind of a law. Thank God in the United States, Muslims and Jews and Christians can dress as they please, because we don't have an institutionalization of secularism. Secularism in its good sense is good. That is to say that the government is non-ecclesiastical. Doesn't mean it's anti-ecclesiastical. It's just non-ecclesiastical, and that's good. But secularism in the bad sense is not religious liberty, it's religious toleration. Only the religious practices that the state will tolerate. And the French are not going to tolerate you looking non-French. No wonder Muslims love to live here. No wonder Jews and Christians enjoy living here, because here we have religious liberty. And I'd like to end this sentiment by suggesting to you an article that's truly inspiring. Daniel Dreisbach at the American University, a personal friend of mine, in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography of 2000, wrote a splendid article based in June of 1776, not in July, with the Declaration of Independence, but George Mason, there's a university named after him in Virginia, wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, in the last clause of that, he wrote a beautiful statement of religious toleration in America. Now immediately, James Madison, you got a George Mason, an Anglican, and James Madison, an Anglican, said, I object to the term religious toleration. I want us to change it to religious liberty. Because if the government ever tolerates religion, if the government ever gives rights, it can take them away. And that's what the secularized French are doing to their Jews and Muslims and Christians. Whereas in the United States, we're secular in that we are non-ecclesiastical, the civil government, obviously, but we're one nation under God. That God, as you define Him, is where we get our definitions of justice and liberty, the things that set us free free under law, the rule of law and not of men. I would like to suggest to you, those of you who are Muslims, for whom this tradition is maybe new and it's part of your civilizational struggle right now, I would like you to read that debate as Dreisbach has given it to us, Dreisbach, Daniel Dreisbach, in the debate between George Mason defending religious toleration and James Madison defending religious liberty. Folks, there is a difference, and that difference is the American experience in liberty. It is rock bottom to the Bush doctrine. That we're going back to this idea of religious liberty and reform, which is prior to and the source of our stability. And that religious toleration is not an inalienable right, it's a concessionary right that governments concede to us, and what government gives, government can take away. And remember, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which came 11 years later, 1776 to 1787, and then the Bill of Rights, which were ratified in 1791, were designed to harness government. It was designed to protect citizens from government. Muslims have a tremendous problem in this area. They're struggling with this. They not only have their own theocrats to the right, but then they've got these autocrats and these dictators supported by American money and power. But folks, now that the Soviet Union is gone, and now that the United States is returning to a reformist policy, the Democrats can now assert their doctrines of liberty and their doctrines of politics and of law. Now I want to end with, I'm almost out of time, with a few sentiments about Islamic constitutionalism. Muslims are writing their own constitutions. Afghanistan has declared itself an Islamic state, but it has written into the Constitution all kinds of human rights language and doctrines. In time we will see if that prevails. But we have a duty, in the name of love and of justice, to defend these Muslim Democrats. Not just because they are our friends, but they are entitled to the religious liberty of their doctrines. And the Islamic extremists, the Islamists, have no right to murder them. We have a duty to allow Islam to become the Islam it wishes to be. And it's the same thing in Iraq. Iraq has a preliminary constitution. It's declared itself an Islamic government. And it says that Sharia shall be a rule of law. It doesn't say the rule of law. Neither does Afghanistan say that Islamic law, Sharia law, is the rule of law. But it says the Islamic religion is the rule. And all kinds of human rights doctrines there for men and for women are written into that. I want to give you my opinion, folks, and that's why I'm here pleading with you. We must not disengage from Iraq. You will see reprisals of unbelievable, horrific levels of the Islamists against the reformists. They will settle that score. Millions of Muslim Democrats will die if we withdraw from Iraq at this time, and especially the same for Afghanistan, which is at the moment a little bit more than Kabul. We must stay the course. The greatest blessing we can give to Islam, and this is not a selfish American thing, and it's not about oil, and it's not about empire. We want to leave Iraq, but we want to leave them safely. Once they have their own constitution, and once we devise their own governments, whether it's going to be Islamic or not, it will have written in it all of these modern doctrines that we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 and following. And we're hoping it will not be like the Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights. Did you know there is such a thing? Did you know that in 1981, the only religion on earth that has ever written a human rights document contrary to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 by the United Nations is Islam? In London in 1981, they came up with the Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights. And what happens is, and I would like to suggest to you a marvelous study on this by Anne Elizabeth Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, University of Pennsylvania, Islam and Human Rights. Read her book. She has read these documents in English and in Arabic. And she will make it very clear to you that as Sharia is exalted, human rights are diminished. Guess what? We don't believe in Muslim rights. We don't believe in Christian rights. We don't believe in Jewish rights. We believe in human rights. Human rights. Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and everyone else are human beings. It's on this basis of humanity that is so important. Let me remind you that right on this campus, you have a scholar, Khalid Abul El-Fadl, who teaches Islamic law here at UCLA. I've read his book. I have a copy of it right here with me, Islam and the Challenge of Democracy. And in this book, he gives the doctrine of man as the Khalifa, the one who is the representative of God, the one who is the vicegerent under God, and the Khilafah would be the vicegerency of man under God. And the doctrine of man needs to be fully understood by Islam, he said, so that on the one hand, man is able to, by voluntary agreement, by contract, by covenant, to form governments of their choice. But at the same time, it takes away the pretense of deity to these autocrats or to these theocrats who would seek to rule Muslim societies by their own whim. And so, while Mr. Abu El-Fadl, is not a friend of the Bush policy as I am, he is opposed to it. I went to his office the other day to meet him, to tell him what I liked and disliked about his book, tell him I love his democratic doctrines, I love the way he reads the Quran and Sharia law, but I wanted to defend the Bush policy with him as the most humane possible thing we could do for Democrats like him. We need to defend the Abu al-Fadls in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there are many of them. And the only way we're going to defend them at this point is to remove the dictator, like Saddam Hussein, an egregious example, to remove the Taliban, who are oppressing everybody in Afghanistan, and then let the Muslims install the own kind of government they want, whether secular or Islamist, just as long as it's centered in human rights and in the doctrine of man. Either man as in the image of God, as we Jews and Christians teach it in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or man as the representative of God, the Khalifa of God, as it is taught in Surah 2:30 and other places in the Quran. And he wasn't there. He's on leave for 1 year to Yale University, where he did his undergraduate. And he's teaching Islamic law at Yale, so I didn't get a chance to dialogue with him. So if you see him, give him my regards. I'm working emails with him. It's possible I have an email from him when I get back to Virginia. I don't have my computer with me on this trip. But I applaud the doctrines of humanity and democracy that he so bravely espoused. And I regret that he accuses, I'll be bold here, he accuses the Bush administration of being theocratic. He says that Bush is a religious colonialist, and he's using these fancy words like democracy and liberty as an effort to establish Christianity in the Middle East. And in the effort to get our oil, in the effort to do their conquest. And I'd like to suggest to you that it's really quite simple. President Bush is not a good speaker. I don't know if he's a good thinker or not because I can only hear what he says. And I rarely can figure that out. But he's got wonderful instincts, and I can tell you what he's thinking. He's decided that James Madison is correct on religious liberty and George Mason is wrong on religious toleration. Here we have two Anglicans in 1776. One was an establishmentarian. We've got to have the Church of England. We have to have a Church of the United States. And James Madison said, no. You've got a Church of England, okay, but there's not going to be a Church of the United States. You may have a Church of Canada. You may have a Church of England. The Anglicans or the Episcopalians. We will not have a Church of the United States. That's not separation of God and state, morality and state, separation of the institution of the church from the institution of government. It's jurisdiction. It is law. It is order. It is jurisdictional. Each one speaking the law in their own delegated authority. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar, unto God what is God's. Make a distinction between tithes and taxes. Pay them both, honor them both, and give heartily, voluntarily, and cheerfully. I'm out of time. I'm going to end with two very brief sentiments. I want you to, in your own tradition, to pray for Indonesia. There are many kinds of Islam, and there are 5 religious schools. You've got the Shiite law, and then you have the Sunni law. You have 4 schools of law under Sunnis. And I could go into the terms, but I'm out of time. But Indonesia is in the most liberal, the most democratic, the most progressive legal tradition in Islam. It's the Hanafi school of Islam. And Indonesians are not Arabs. And they don't mind being Islamified. They don't want to be Arabized. They are Indonesian. And they're a very tolerant people. And it's a successful democracy on the earth. We do have some Muslim democracies. It's not accidental that most of them are non-Arab, such as Turkey, which is not Arab. It's Turkish Muslim. Indonesia, which is not Arab, it's Indonesian democracy, in which you have a huge amount of toleration and to some degree religious liberty. Clearly democratic themes. Abdul Rahman Walid is a great democratic thinker in Indonesia. But what is happening, and this is a matter of fact, it's a matter of opinion here, the Saudi Arabian government, which is not only Hanbali, the most fundamentalist of all the political and legal doctrines in Islam, it's not only Hanbali, but it's Wahhabi. And they're sending millions of riyals, millions of dollars into Indonesia to Islamify, to radicalize Indonesia. Many Christians, as well as moderate Muslims, have died in Indonesia in the name of Osama bin Laden's attempt to Islamify Muslims. And by him, that means to conduct his holy war with the West and with infidels. Indonesia is going through a terrible price right now. So I've talked to you tonight about the Middle East broadly, and even Indonesia outside the Middle East. I implore you, regardless of what your political opinions may be, do not abandon Afghanistan. Do not abandon Iraq. Do not pull out these troops prematurely. Let's give the security to these Democrats that they may live. If you don't believe my doctrines of law, believe my doctrine of love. We have a duty of love to these Muslims who want to be free and not merely to conform. It's not just taqlid, it's not just conformity, but it's liberty. Not just religious toleration, it's religious liberty. A right that God gives, an unalienable right, not a concessionary right. And I want to end, excuse me for referring to the almighty dollar, but I want to remind you of something. I go in my wallet and I don't find any $100 bills there, but I do find a $1 bill. And I'll end with this little lesson. Turn the $1 bill to the faded side, and you will see above the pyramid with the all-seeing eye, you'll see a Latin inscription, Annuit Coeptis. In the classical Latin, literally that means he has nodded at our beginnings. It means that God has condescendingly smiled upon our humble beginnings as a nation. He approves of our efforts to be free. And underneath that pyramid, you have written in Latin, Novus Ordo Seclorum. Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages. What does that mean? What does the new order of the ages mean? Well, our forefathers knew what it meant. It doesn't mean that the United States was the first Christian country. There are plenty of Christian countries before us. It doesn't mean the United States was the first secular company, because seclorum doesn't mean secular, it means of the ages, of the times. But here's what's novus ordo. Here's what's new about this order that you and I are enjoying right now in this university that so much enjoys free speech. The United States was the first nation on earth to have a Christian country, culturally and legally, without an established church. Our laws were based on the Judeo-Christian tradition and the philosophies that flow from that, and also secular thinking that is in accord with that. And we were a Christian country, not because everyone had to be Christians, obviously, not because everyone conforms to Christ. No, that's not true, never was true. But we were based upon the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Old and the New Testament. But we were the first to do that without an established church. We were disestablishment. When you learned to spell in grammar school, that word, remember that big word? Disestablishmentarianism, and then you got anti-disestablishmentarianism? Establishment is they wanted a state church like in England. George Mason wanted that. He wanted, as a good Anglican, to have religious toleration under Christendom. And yet, James Madison said, no, I'm an Anglican, but I don't want establishment. I am disestablishment. I'm non-establishment. And when George Mason opposed him, George Mason became anti-disestablishment. So you can have anti-disestablishmentarianism, and therefore be anti-disestablishmentarianistic. You can keep piling up all these letters. Folks, I want to spread the good news. We are the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the first Judeo-Christian tradition to have a disestablished church. I want to tell you that's the pearl of great price. And it is my hope that these new Muslim democracies will not only enjoy their new freedom under a redefined Islam, which they define themselves from their own religious traditions, but it's my hope that they will come to the realization that over time that we came to, by the process of elimination and observation, that separation of church and state institutionally, jurisdictionally, makes us a free church in a free state. Receive that blessing. Thank you very much.
My question is, you advocated supporting the Democrats in Muslim and Arab countries. Is it possible that if you give the vote to the majority of people in a certain country, i.e. Saudi Arabia, among others, I remember an internal memo that was leaked saying that 95% of Saudis supported bin Laden and his cause, that they might elect a Hanbali government, and they might elect not to give women the right to drive or the right to vote or something like that, and then aren't you just as lost? And the second part of my question is, in terms of policy, can you give us any, can you advocate anything specifically in terms of how to deal with Syria, possibly Iran, a nuclear threat, or Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
What would I do if, since we're allowing Muslims to form their own government they want, suppose they reject democracy? What would I do in this instance? The answer is, we have only entered into 2 countries, and we only intend to enter into 2 countries. In Afghanistan, because of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden, who planned that raid against the United States, we had to go in there and oppose those who declared war on us. And there was no way that we were going to permit a constitution, Islamic or otherwise, that did not have clauses on human rights protecting all the religious minorities, as well as men and women and all the other issues, as inalienable rights, rights that Man does not give, man cannot take away, not even governments. Not concessionary rights that Islam gives to us that Islam can take away. And the same thing in Iraq. We went there because of Saddam Hussein, and we knew that he had used weapons of mass destruction. We knew that he could use them again. We knew, because he had already used of the ABC, atomic, biological, and chemical, or if you wish, NBC, nuclear and biological and chemical. He had used the biological and the chemical. We thought he also had atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. Maybe we were wrong about that. But one thing is for sure, Saddam himself was the weapon of mass destruction. He was completely predictable in how he had used them against his own people. He had already started 2 wars, one against Iran in the 80s and one against Kuwait in the 90s. And he was threatening to do more, and our intelligence, as limited as it was, knew that he was doing more. And we knew that he was seeking nuclear weapons. And we knew that there was some contact with terrorist groups, although in general, Saddam had his own terror. He liked to be in control. He was his own mafioso. So we went in there because of the doctrine of preemption. That is to say, here in the Judeo-Christian West, we teach that war has to be moral. And by that definition, it has to be defensive. We don't start wars, we finish them. But in a defensive war, you also have to allow for the doctrine of preemption. Preemption is a species of defensive war. Let me illustrate. In June the 5th, and in 1956, in 1967, and during the Six-Day War, the Israeli government had learned that the Egyptian Air Force was going to invade Israel at 9 a.m. in the morning. So the Israeli Air Force went in at 8:45 in the morning. The tarmac was loaded with planes filled with gasoline and with bombs destined for Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities, and destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force in one morning on the tarmac at Cairo. This was defensive because it was a preemptive raid in an act of defense to an inevitable attack. Your police officers right here in Los Angeles have the same doctrine, defense that may include a preemption. A police officer doesn't have to wait until you fire your revolver. All you have to do is draw on him, and he has the right to presume if you pull a weapon, you're going to use it. He doesn't have to wait until the bullet is actually in flight before he has the right to duck. You pull a weapon on him, he will fire in defense of himself to prevent an inevitable use, at least the presumption of it. And we use these doctrines of defense all the time. And that was the basis of going into Iraq, that we were facing a predictable inevitability. We just didn't know how bad it was. So in our attempt to have, and I'll end this part of it, in our attempt to have reform and then stability based upon righteousness, on the rule of law and of liberty, we sometimes, ironically, have to first of all remove the autocrat, the one who is preventing all reform, which Saddam was, of course, the consummate case. And we've only had to do that in Afghanistan and Iraq. These are the only ones who were a personal threat to U.S. interests. But Iraq, remember, is far more strategic than Afghanistan. And I'll allude now to Syria and to Iran, and then I'll go to the next question. To Iraq, to the east, you have Iran. To the south, you have Saudi Arabia. To the southwest, you have Egypt. And to the west, you have Israel and the Palestinians. And to the northwest, you have the Lebanon and Syria. And then to the north, you have Turkey. Completely strategic. If we allow a relatively liberal Iraq, where the greatest amount of religious liberty there was in the Middle East, certainly the greatest amount of toleration, the greatest amount of education, because Saddam was a secularist. He was not a good Muslim. And he allowed a lot of religious liberty just as long as he had complete control of it. So there is great hope that the reformists and the secularists among the Muslims in Iraq can transform the government. They want it according to human rights. They do want to protect the minorities. They do want gender equality. Now, there are many Islamists among them, especially those, and the last part of that question is, what do we do with these people who are invading from Iran, especially Hamas, Harakat al-Muqawwa al-Islamiyah, the Islamic resistance group, who are bent upon imposing their jihad, which they call nationalism, but it is an Islamist, it is a jihadist Islam to expel the West, especially the Americans, the non-Muslims, so that they can impose an Iranian style of religious regime upon Iraq. And what do we do with the Syrians who are coming in from the northwest into Iraq? The answer is we have to have a military stabilization to protect the reformists and the secularists who are there. We have to protect them from themselves, those left over from the Ba'ath regime of the secular socialist Iraqi state, the Saddam loyalists. We have to protect them from the Islamists that are flowing in from Iran and Iraq, Iran and Syria. So we're there to establish democracies. They tell us what kind of democracy they want for the protection of human rights. And we have no plans of war with Iran or with Syria. And they've declared no war with us. But they have movements among them that are strongly Islamist and a great threat to the Iraqi people. So justice and love, great Judeo-Christian principles, requires us, I think, to remain there for security reasons and stability reasons while they're instituting their constitution. Thank you for hearing that long response.
Here's a question from one person in the audience. The question is, why did Saddam Hussein kick the UN weapons inspectors out of Iraq during the 1990s? And why did the UN not seem to do anything about that? The actual question was roll over and play dead.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
sure.
Yeah, that's a great mystery to me. Everybody is stumped by that. We know that he had biological weapons. We know that he had chemical weapons. We know that he had a trajectory to deliver them. We know that he had used them on his own people. We know that he dropped Scuds on Tel Aviv. Who has ever dropped missiles on Tel Aviv, knowing that he was trying to divide the coalition in the first Gulf War? He did none of that in Gulf II. He did none of that in 2003 that he had done in 1990, 1991. And then when we get there, we find out, apparently, unless we still haven't found them, that he didn't have the nuclear capacity, not even in 90 and not in 2003. But why didn't he use the others? Why did he play the hide-and-seek tactic that he played? I just don't know. I'm puzzled by it. It's very hard to understand why Saddam did the power plays that he did. I will take a guess. It's a democratic country. It's free, no charge to guess. I think he was jerking us around. I think he enjoyed playing power plays with the United Nations and with the United States. And I think one of his motivations was to embarrass us, that if he lost this conflict, which was almost inevitable, that he would not be what we were accusing him of being. And inspections would blow that secret. So he figures that the United States is determined to come in here and rectify the Kuwaiti situation and rectify the degradation of human rights and the aggravations and power plays in September 11, and to stabilize this area of the Middle East. So I won't let the United Nations know what I've got, and I'll let the Americans come in and then face the embarrassment that I'm not what they thought I was completely. I guess it's part of this mind games that he plays. I don't have a better explanation for that as to why he did that.
Dr. Kigasola, there's a question that came from the audience, which was, given that the Quran states that Jesus was not crucified, how do Muslims view how does the Muslim world view Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ? And could the Passion be considered by some as a weapon of mass instruction that they might have been looking for Christians to do or the Americans to do?
Interesting. The premise is correct, whoever wrote this question. In the Quran, you have this very interesting thing, that they believed that Jesus was born of a virgin, of Maryam, whom we call Mary. They believed that he lived a sinless life. Muhammad never claimed to be sinless. They believed that Jesus Christ performed many miracles. Muhammad did not perform many miracles. They believed that Jesus, instead of dying, and certainly not by crucifixion, he ascended into heaven. And someday he's going to return to earth. He's going to convert the whole world to Islam. He's going to tell us Christians that we Christians seriously misunderstood him. He was really preaching Islam rather than Christianity. And then after Jesus converts the whole world, the whole Christian world to Islam, then it's his turn to die. And when he dies, Allah will reward him by the permission to be buried in Medina, right next to Muhammad. Now, as a Christian, I don't think Jesus is very flattered by that praise or by that honor to be buried next to Muhammad. But I will tell you this, Islam is true to the New Testament when it says that Jesus was virgin born and sinless and performed many miracles. But one thing Islam will not accept is substitutionary atonement. That God in his love, the wages of sin is death. And if he gave us the result of our sins, there'd be no mission field. We'd all be dead. So God allows for culture and history. He brings Christ into history. And Jehovah Jesus, there on the cross, on the altar of Golgotha, gave his life for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim and pagan sinners all over the world. And in doing that, God fulfills his justice in that the wages of sin is death. Yet he also fulfills his love in that there needn't only be hell, there can also be heaven for those who would trust in Christ's atonement. Islam is unambiguous about this. He certainly didn't die on the cross, and there can be no substitutionary atonement. We are saved by our own righteous deeds and by the gracious acts of Allah toward us. We are not saved by someone else's righteousness. And of course, that's premised on the idea that Jesus is a prophet. He is not God in the flesh. So when I dialogue with Muslims, I quote to them Surah 5, 116, "Ittakhaduni wa ummiya ilahaini min dunillah," which in Arabic means Jesus was facing, the Quran is describing how Jesus someday will face the judgment. And Allah on that day is going to ask Jesus, Jesus, did you say, which I quoted in Arabic, did you say, take me and my mother as two gods in addition to Allah? Did you teach that? Are you a Trinitarian? And the way I dialogue with Muslims about Surah 5, 116, is that Muhammad's understanding of the Trinity was Papa God, Mama God, and Baby God. Take me, Jesus, and my mother, Mary, as two gods in addition to Allah, God the Father. Allah, God the Father, Mary, God the Mother, Jesus, God the Son. And I tell Muslims, I'm very glad that Muhammad trashed that kind of a Trinity, because Christians have never taught that the Trinity is biological. They have never taught that it's Papa God, Mama God, Baby God, but it's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, one God. And we've never taught that God can become a man. We've never taught that. The Quran emphatically resists the idea that God can become a man. So we reject the subtraction. God ceases to be God and he becomes a man. But we preach addition. This is a religious question, so I'm giving a religious answer. In Christendom, we Orthodox Christians, we teach what the Bible says, that God added humanity to his deity. The incarnation is not that God ceases to be God, he becomes a man. That's not existentially possible. But God can add time to his eternity. He can add flesh to his spirit and not cease to be God. He simply becomes the God-man. He becomes God incarnates, in the flesh. Now, whether or not that's true, that is what the New Testament is teaching. One other thing I need to say here. Yes, Muslims reject the cross. Gibson's film powerfully portrays the passion of Jesus Christ, the one who is guilty in Jewish eyes, the one who is guilty in Roman eyes, and one who, a whole lot of pagans who are willing to kill him, but he was innocent. And he did it for us. Some of the flashbacks bring out that point, as well as books from Reverend John Piper and others of Bethlehem Baptist Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, and other excellent books bring out 50 reasons as to why Jesus died, why the Gibson film, which is only on the passion, those 12 hours of suffering, is based upon the incarnation, the love of God for humankind. So I just say this to pagans, to Muslims, and to Jews in our own Judeo-Christian tradition. I would say it is not possible for God to become a man. Jews and Muslims are right, but it is possible. I believe it's actual that God can add humanity to his deity. And therefore, the Messiah is Jehovah Jesus. He is God in the flesh. One last statement. Trinity is a theory about the deity of Jesus. If what I've said is correct, that Jesus is God in the flesh, that's what Christianity is. You want my definition of a Christian? Is one who affirms and believes the idea that Jesus is God in the flesh. You have seen me, have seen the Father. Now, in an attempt to explain that, we come up with God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, three persons in one essence. I think that's the best theory out there. I accept the Nicene doctrine, the Chalcedon doctrine, ecumenical councils within the church in 325 and 451. I think Trinity is the best speculation, the best theory, the best post-biblical theory to explain biblical phenomenon. The word Trinity, Trinitas, is a Latin word invented by Tertullian in the year 207 AD. He invented a word, Trinity, to explain a biblical phenomenon. So Trinity is not in the Bible, it's a theory about the Bible. It's a theory that I think is the most correct. But that's not how I define a Christian. There are plenty of Christians in the Middle East who are not Trinitarian. They're in different traditions. But to be a Christian, they believe that Jesus is God. And they're trying to say to Muslims, it's not the Trinity that Muhammad was opposing, Papa God, Mama God, Baby God. And it's not God becoming a man, ceasing to be a God and becoming a man. But God adds humanity to his deity, time to his eternal experience for us in the image of God, certainly his vicegerents, his Khalifa, if you will, on earth to enjoy that salvation which he in such justice and love has provided.